The heat of the desert clung to Clara's skin like a punishment. The kind of heat that seeped into bones and made the air shimmer in waves, distorting the world as though even reality could not bear to stay still in this place. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, the roughness of calluses catching against damp skin, and squinted toward the horizon where dust rose like smoke. This ranch town had always been a cage for her, one that disguised its bars with wooden fences and wide skies. But she had never been free here, not truly, not since her childhood. Men had looked at her with eyes that measured rather than admired, eyes that calculated worth the way they might assess a horse or a piece of land. They wanted her body, yes, but never her soul, never the storms she carried inside, never the sharp tongue that burned as hot as the summer wind. She had grown used to the whispers that followed her down the street, to the way women narrowed their eyes in judgment, while their husbands let their gazes linger too long. She had built her armor from silence, from bitter laughter, from the belief that no one would ever want her beyond the flesh she was forced to carry. It was on one such blistering day that she first saw him, Luke, the cowboy whose arrival felt less like chance and more like the storm. This land had been holding back for years. He rode in on a stallion black as night, moving with the kind of ease that suggested he belonged, nowhere and everywhere all at once. He didn't smile at the saloon doors, didn't tip his hat to the gossips by the well, didn't glance at the storekeeper's daughter who preened at his passing. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, cold and clear, but not empty. Clara noticed him because he noticed nothing, because he seemed untouched by the thirst that consumed every other man in this place. She hated him for it immediately, hated how her breath caught in her throat as though she had been waiting for a man like him to appear and shatter her careful walls. And yet that night, as the stars cut sharp, silver lines through the darkness and the cicadas hummed their endless song, she found herself crossing paths with him in the shadow behind the saloon. He leaned against the wall, hat pulled low, the smoke of his cigarette curling upward like a prayer never meant to be heard. She had been drawn there by anger she couldn't name, by curiosity she swore she didn't feel, and when his eyes finally lifted to meet hers, she spoke the only words she thought he expected. "You want me for my body," she whispered, not as a question, but as a weapon, because it was what they all wanted, and she would rather cut the truth free than let it fester. For a moment silence stretched between them, thick enough to choke on, and she thought he would smirk, confirm what she already knew, reduce her to the shape of her hips and the curve of her lips. But instead he pushed off the wall, slow and deliberate, and stepped close enough that she could see the scars that crossed his jaw like forgotten maps. His voice was low, steady, like thunder far off on the horizon. "No," he said, the single word heavier than any sermon she had ever heard. "I want you because you don't beg." The morning after their whispered exchange, Clara woke with the weight of his words, pressing against her chest like a second heartbeat, unfamiliar and unsettling, because she had never been wanted for anything other than the curve of her waist, or the shape of her lips, never for the way she endured, never for the sharp steel she carried in her silence. And Luke's voice had split her wide open in a way that frightened her more than any man's hands ever had. The town was already alive with murmurs by the time she stepped out into the street, skirts brushing against the dust, chin lifted higher than she felt. People had seen them together, had noticed the way she lingered in the shadows with the new cowboy, and tongues wagged as though she were already guilty of some sin they themselves longed to taste. The women sneered behind their hands, pretending to pity her while reveling in the scandal, and the men watched her with that same measuring hunger she had grown up fighting. But Luke's gaze the night before had not been the same, and it burned in her memory like a brand she could neither wash away nor ignore. She told herself she didn't care, that she wouldn't see him again, that she didn't need a man whose silence cut sharper than her own. But her resolve faltered when the saloon doors swung wide that afternoon, and Luke walked in like he had been carved from the desert itself, tall, unyielding, carrying a presence that quieted even the drunks at the poker tables. He didn't look at her, not once. But somehow the space between them vibrated with a tension she could feel in her bones. She wanted to hate him for it, for making her feel alive in a place that had only ever taught her to wither, but hatred could not survive in the same breath as longing, and that terrified her more than anything. Yet before she could think too long on it, shadows from her past arrived in the shape of a man. She thought she had escaped. The ex who had broken her spirit in pieces, so small she had believed she would never find them again. His voice cut across the room, too loud, too confident, as he called her name with a false sweetness that made her stomach knot, and the saloon fell silent as heads turned to watch. Fear clawed at her throat, the kind of fear that steals both breath and speech, but she stood anyway, refusing to cower, though her knees trembled beneath her skirt. Luke shifted in his chair then, just enough for her to know he was watching, just enough for her to feel that steady strength pressing against her back like a wall she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Her ex smirked, eyes crawling over her with that same greedy entitlement she had endured for years, and when he reached out as if to grab her arm, the air snapped with the sound of Luke's chair legs dragging against the wooden floor. He didn't speak, not yet, but the weight of his presence alone was enough to stall the man's hand in midair. For the first time, Clara realized what it meant to have someone stand beside her without demanding her surrender, someone who didn't see her as a body to be claimed but as a storm to be matched. And though her fear still pulsed hot and wild, there was also a new spark, a fierce and unfamiliar courage that told her she would not run again. Not this time. Not with Luke's steady gaze anchoring her in place like thunder before the rain.